The U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio is also in Brussels this Thursday for a NATO meeting with the alliance's foreign ministers. The trip comes at a moment of deep anxiety, one day after Trump imposed sweeping tariffs on the world's biggest economies, raising the prospect of a full-blown trade war that does threaten to upend the global economy. Adding to the tensions are concerns over Trump's ever-shifting foreign policy. We're going to talk about all of this now with France 24's Doug Herbert, who joins me on set. Doug, Marco Rubio meeting with the NATO partners at this very complicated moment now in world history. I mean, can the NATO partners trust the U.S. and U.S. commitments when Trump's rhetoric often seems to undermine NATO?
The easy, oversimplified answer to your question is no, they cannot trust the U.S., at least not to the degree that they have been able to historically over the past 80 years in the post-war period, been able to trust the U.S. as a long-standing, irrevocable ally through thick and thin. We're out with that era that prevailed under the Biden administration and just about every administration since the war of cooperation, of harmony, of a certain inbuilt, hardwired trust, transatlantic trust. Now in its place, what we're seeing is a more brutalist politics. Some might call it a more predatory politics, a world in which, and a transatlantic alliance in which you have creditors and debtors. And Donald Trump has been very clear about that. Europe is essentially in debt to the U.S. and more specifically NATO. Now, Marco Rubio, interesting character here, Jeannie, because he's the U.S. Secretary of State. As such, he is as much a part of as anyone of the inner circle of Donald Trump's national security team. He is in on all those big decisions. Yet what gets more interesting is that, A, he's not seen as having personally a very close relationship with Donald Trump. And this is very important with Donald Trump. Do you play golf with him? Are you his golfing buddy? Does he, pick up the phone and chat with you, at night? All of that stuff. And Rubio's not seen as being that person. I'm not a fly on the wall in the Oval Office, so I can't be sure. But he's seen as being a little more distant. He's also been considered by some as being, there are no adults in this room, critics would say, in this administration. There were a few in Trump's first term. But if you have to identify one semi-adult in the room, it would be Marco Rubio. He is someone that even here in Europe, NATO allies and foreign ministers consider to be perhaps the most pro-NATO, pro-alliance member of Trump's top official team. Why do we say that? He was a Florida senator back in 2023, and as such, in that previous role, he actually co-sponsored a bill in Congress that would have required presidents to seek the consent, that is a vote of approval by the Senate, if they were considering withdrawing from the Western alliance, pulling out of NATO. This is something that Trump has not explicitly said he was going to do, but it's been in the air. Would he pull out of NATO? Now, I'll just end by saying this morning, Marco Rubio arrived echoing, basically rebutting what he called the hysteria in the media, that there's any sort of bad blood between the U.S. and NATO. He said the U.S. is as active in NATO as ever. Donald Trump supports NATO. These are Marco Rubio's words. And once again, echoing Donald Trump's perennial refrain, calling on members, step up their spending. Not the 2% that used to be that ceiling. 5%. That's a very heavy lift.
Now, given all of that, is Marco Rubio's call for a swift end to the war in Ukraine a signal that Trump's willing to appease Vladimir Putin?
I don't even think Donald Trump can answer that question because it's too easy to write an easy narrative. What we do know clearly is Donald Trump wants a swift war to the end in Ukraine. Those are the marching orders of everyone in his cabinet. Anyone who goes anywhere and makes statements has to basically reflect that line. We want this war over sooner rather than later. We don't want further engagement in overseas conflicts and wars. That said, Donald Trump himself has been blowing hot and cold, even where Vladimir Putin is concerned, where the narrative has been he's very cozy with Putin. He's parroting all of Putin's talking points on the war. He's a Kremlin agent. He's been bought out by Russia. He's a Russian agent. All of that you have to sort of, counterpose with the fact that at the same time, he said in recent days he's come down hard on Putin. And he's basically, insinuated that, Putin also has to hold up his end of the deal in these talks. We don't know exactly where Trump stands, which means no one else in his cabinet knows exactly where Trump stands. Everyone is really doing this on the fly. And perhaps more than any other administration ever, they're all ultimately beholden to the whims and to the whims of Donald Trump, of the president himself. Anything Marco Rubio says today has to, by definition, be taken with a grain of salt because it's not Donald Trump himself saying it. And that goes especially for where the Ukraine ceasefire prospects go from here.
Doug,